Hello and welcome to this first video in this series on the basics of getting started with Modo. And just so you know, I'll be working with Modo 11 version 2, which has only just been released. When you first open up Modo, this is your default view. Most of the screen is taken up by the 3D window, but along the top you've got a fairly generic menu bar with sections such as File, where you can start a new project, open a recent project, save, export, import, etc. You've got Edit, View, Geometry, Render, Layout, etc. Lots of options in here. Underneath System you have your preferences, which we'll go into shortly, and next to that you've got a very useful help system. Directly below that you have different tabs, and each of these is dedicated to a different task that you can carry out in Modo. For example, currently we're in the Model tab, as indicated by the orange underscore, and it does as you would expect. In this tab you do all your modelling, and you have all your modelling tools arranged down the left hand side, and there are further tabs inside here, and you simply left click through them. To change to a different tab, for example topology, simply left click on that tab. The orange underscore changes to indicate that's what you're currently in. The main screen might change, and your tools on the left are dedicated to topology, and again you've got another tab there. Next to that you've got UV Edit, where you edit your UVs, quite obviously. Again, different tools on the left hand side. Then you've got a Paint tab, dedicated to painting, Layout, Setup, Game Tools, Animate, Render, Scripting, which I won't be going into, and finally Schematic Fusion, which is basically like advanced Boolean operations. There is an alternative way to go through these tabs, and in version 11 onwards you press Ctrl Shift simultaneously and tap on the Tab button, and under here you've got the same options arranged slightly differently, but there's your Model tab, topology, etc., and you simply left click. That is useful because if you want to free up some screen real estate, you can get rid of this bar simply by left clicking in here. So you've clicked in there, those tabs are gone, Control Shift, tap on Tab, and there you go. You can go to, for example, topology. Personally, I don't use this. I prefer the icons, or rather the tabs up the top, but it's completely up to you. So coming down on the interface, you have all these icons underneath, and underneath the Model tab, these are for your selections. So for example, select different mesh items, materials, and these are the components, the polygons, edges and vertices. Then you've got Action Center, which I'll cover later. You have Symmetry, in case you want to create a symmetrical model. You have your fall off button here, different fall offs. Snapping, to turn that on and off, and you have your options down here when you do so. Select through, work plane options, and I'll cover the work plane in a later video. And finally selection sets. And these icons, some will stay the same, but others might disappear or be completely replaced depending which tab you're in. So for example, these look the same in the topology tab, the UV Edit and the Paint. We go to Layout, and you've got a couple of extras, or rather one extra here, although these stay the same. Your setup looks completely different, although you've still got the same selection icons here, although they're slightly different. A couple of icons added here, game tools, a couple of different ones here. Under the animate they completely disappear, and they're back again with the render tab, but you've got a couple of extras. Scripting looks slightly different again, and then schematic fusion completely different. So obviously these change dependent which tab you're under. On the right hand side you have your items list, and this basically contains all the items that are in your scene. For example, your camera, any meshes, lights, etc. And then you've got different tabs after that. Now, this arrow is simply signifying that there are further tabs that you can't currently see. So if you were to left click here, where you see those two arrows appear, and drag it out, and you can see you've got further tabs. And you can also add tabs by clicking the plus, and then you can add whatever you like there. So let's go back to item list. Below that you have properties, and these are properties of what you've currently got selected here. Next to that you have channels and lists, and again you can add different tabs as you see fit. So let's just shrink that back down a bit. All of the interface is quite malleable. You can drag it out, you can shrink it. So basically on the left hand side, now that we've shrunk it, you still have the same options, but they're hidden behind these tabs in case you want more screen space. Simply left click, drag to make it bigger or smaller. Now sometimes, if I can find one, see like here, sometimes you'll click through one of these tabs and you'll see these two arrows. These two arrows mean that there are further items below. So you either click on the arrows to bring out the other options, or simply drag that down, and as you see, auto re-topo down are revealed down here. So simply drag that down or up, and as you see, that'll cut off the list, but it still remains there underneath those arrows. So it's very customizable. Simply place, shrink, expand, do whatever you like to suit your needs. While you're in the model tab, if you look above your tools, you have two buttons, and these buttons, they will change depending which tab you're in. So I'll go to topology, change to model and sculpt, model UV under UV edit, model and presets under paint, layout is back to model and sculpt, same with setup, game tools they disappear completely, animate they've gone, onto render again model and sculpt, scripting they look different but it's model and presets, and they disappear under schematic fusion. So let's go back to the model tab, click on sculpt, and it brings up this floating palette with all your sculpting tools. This palette can be dragged. If you left click on the white box, it can be dragged and repositioned anywhere on the screen, and while it's in view it will persist regardless which tab you're in. So you can reposition it, you can close it by hovering on the right hand side until you see this white cross, click on that and it will close it. In the topology tab if you wanted to make a quick edit to your model, instead of having to go to the model tab and then click through your tools, you simply click model, and as you see, it brings up the exact same tools that are in the modeling tab without having to go into the modeling tab. So this is a quick way of going through and using different tools while you're in a different tab that usually wouldn't allow you to use those tools. Next up, I'd like to discuss the viewport properties for how your 3D scene is displayed within Modo. And this, I think, is the default, where you've got a gradient background and then you have a grid on the bottom where you see this red line intersecting this blue line. That's called the work grid. And you've also got this secondary grid here in light grey, which you see flipping to different axes and orientations as I tumble the camera, and that represents the work plane. I won't discuss just yet what a work plane is. I'm going to cover that in a later video, but my preference is to not have all this displayed on screen. I like a much cleaner scene when I'm modelling. So if you want to change it, and I'm not saying you have to, it's totally optional, click this little gear at the top right of your viewport and it brings up the 3D viewport properties. And first off, under drawing and control, you have GL background, and as you can see, it's currently set to gradient. You can also set it to an environment if you have an environment map loaded. Set it to image or set it to none, like I do. Next, if you go to visibility, under general visibility, show work plane. Now I do use work planes, but I don't like them to always be on. So if you click where it says always and set it to active, it disappears because I currently don't have one active, but once I do activate one, I'll see it. And right below that, show grid, I'll just put it on never. And as you can see, it's a lot cleaner to model in. So onto view modes, and in order to show you, I'm going to open a recent file. You might recognise this from my YouTube channel. It's an Imperial shuttle from the Star Wars films. And ignore the pictures in the background, they're just reference photos I'll be working off. And as you can see by this button that says default, this is the default view. We have very slight bit of shading, and obviously your mesh is solid, and on top of that you've got your wireframes. Click on the button and you can change it to a wireframe view. You've also got solid, so it's a solid view with wireframe but no shading. If I had a vertex map, you'd be able to see it in this one. Shaded, much like default, but somewhat darker. If I had a texture on this, this would show up here, and similarly here, shaded texture, which is just texture with shading on. And we've got default. I'll skip over advanced for now. Next, you've got ghost tone shading. Interesting, seems to be based off your camera angle. Next, you've got cell shading, which gives you a comic book look or cartoon. And finally, you have reflection. So let's go back up to advanced, and it'll take a few seconds to kick in. And the advanced viewport, it works, it uses the power of your graphics card. So if you're only using integrated graphics, say like on a laptop, your mileage may vary with this. But as you can see, you get nicer shadows up to a point. I mean, they get a little bit funky on the edges, and say like in here. And especially around the back where I've got these curved shapes, but it'll give you a quick idea what it would look like as a render, I suppose. Now for the advanced viewport, you have got options within the 3D viewport properties. Yeah, down here on the right, advanced options, where you can change the ambient light, the ambient colour, cast shadows or not. If you've got normal maps or bump maps, you can enable or disable them. Change the lighting, depending what lights or environment you've got set up. Change your background. Now, display overwrites. Let me just zoom in. It's quite hard to see at the moment. Let me just go down to, let me just skip over this, turn, that's it, anti-aliasing off. Display override says none, and you can see your wireframes. Whereas if you click on and go render without wireframe, this is the render you get. So I'll turn those back on. I'll skip over visibility because, to be honest, I'm not quite sure how that works. Below that you've got enable ambient occlusion, and now if I click that, for some reason everything breaks and goes dark. I'm not sure whether this is due to my system, whether it's a bug in Modo currently, but it seems to change from session to session, whereas sometimes it'll work, other times it won't. It may well be my system, might be my graphics card drivers, which were updated a few days ago. But basically this just adds extra definition to the shadows in the crevices and makes the shadows look deeper and slightly more realistic. Anti-aliasing. If you look along here, you got these jaggedy bits, and you'll also see it on the wireframe if you're close enough. But click on any of these under anti-aliasing and they start to smooth out. And obviously the higher up you go, the more smooth they go. But again, the advanced viewport uses the power of your GPU. So if you haven't got a powerful graphics card or half decent one, you may not be able to go up to 9x. You might be stuck down here somewhere, or you may not be able to use it at all. I mean, this is all fine for some visualizations, but you possibly wouldn't want to model in it. It'll slow your computer down a little bit, but it gives you a basic understanding of form, shadows, how they fall on your mesh. So I'll stick this back to default, back to our default view. Next to that we've got Ray GL off. Click on that, and for now I'll just click fast, and this will just give you a fast render of your scene. It'll give you basic shadows, but it won't take into account any ambient light. If you go to full, you'll have the ambient light and your shadows back again. But you definitely couldn't model in this mode. This is basically previous. Before you go to your renderer, set it up in here, give you an idea of what result you'll be getting. So I'll just turn that back off. Next, I'd like to discuss the viewing or shading mode of active meshes and inactive meshes. So we're currently in item mode. I'll make this wing my active mesh, which highlights it here and here in the item list. If I go to 3D Viewport Properties, you have two tabs here, one for active mesh and one for inactive. By default, this is unclicked. Make inactive same as active. So if I don't currently have an item active, it will be displayed in a wireframe mode. I'll come back to the options. The inactive meshes, the shading style for those is wireframe. I can change that, and you get the same options here as you do here. So I could change it to reflection, so anything I don't have selected will be reflection, anything I do have selected will be default. So if I now select cockpit, the wing is now reflected and the cockpit is the default. By default, as I say, I make the inactive the same as the active. It just makes more sense to have everything looking the same, like that. Up until now we've been in the perspective view. As you can see, top left, this button says perspective. You can change this by clicking on the button, and you've got top, bottom, back, front, right and left, and all of these are orthographic views. So let me show you that. So you've got zero perspective on these, so you can pan, you can zoom, but as they're orthographic you cannot rotate. Now you've got top, bottom, back, front, left and right. You've also got a camera, so you can look through a particular camera that you've got set up, or you can look through lights if you have any lights. I'll go back to perspective view. But what if you want a traditional full view setup like you would have in other 3D applications? Well, if you come up to the top right and see these two arrows which are highlighted, that means that this view is maximized. So if you were to click that, you would see 4 different views. You have your top view here, your front view, your right view, and any of these you can change at will. So you can have 2 perspective views if you want, or 2 top views, bottom. I'll just set that back to right. Any of these windows, any of these views you can maximize. These controls are copied on all the viewports. Simply click on the 2 arrows and it maximizes that viewport. Now you may have noticed that despite us getting rid of the grid in the perspective view, we still have one in these orthographic views. And the reason for that is every view has its own settings. So currently in this view, as in these views, I have the work grid, or rather the grid, visible. So if I turn that to never, you'll see it disappear from here also. Same with this one. Get rid of it there. Actually that's the show work plane that we can see there. So I'll turn that off. And this one, turn the grid off. And similarly, if you go to the active and inactive meshes, you have separate settings for these windows as you do for this window. So currently the active mesh and the inactive for that matter are both set to wireframe, but we can change the active mesh to be default either by coming here, clicking default here, and you can see this wing is now shaded differently. As if I change the front, then that's shaded differently. Let me just zoom in to show. You can also change it up here and it's back to wireframe. As with this one, you can change the active, or rather the inactive mesh to be the same as the active, and then when you change the shading style, whether they're active or not, they'll be shaded equally. And you can have these settings different in all of these views. Personally, I stick to having the wireframe visible in all views, in all orthographic views, but it's totally up to yourself how you have it. While I've got my model loaded, I'm going to discuss my navigation settings. I don't use the default settings in Modo because over the years I've used several 3D applications, and most of them allow you to change the navigation controls to suit a different application. So if you're used to navigating in that application, you can navigate in another application. And the convention that I've grown used to is the Maya system of navigating. Now if you come up the top to System, Preferences, come down to Input and then Remapping, along the top it says Mouse Input Preset, and as you can see I've currently got it set to Maya Navigation. If you click in there, you can see we've got presets for a lot of other applications. You've got 3ds Max, Alias, Cinema 4D, you have the default Modo setting. You have 4 different settings for Maya. I personally only use Maya Navigation as I found some of the keyboard shortcuts that I was accustomed to don't work in different Maya configurations, so I stick to Maya Navigation. Then you've got Rhino, Soft Image XSI and SolidWorks. So if you're used to any of these applications, navigating in them, by all means change it to them. But as I say, I'm using Maya Navigation, so I'll show you my shortcuts. All navigation hinges on you holding in the Alt key and using a key on your mouse and then dragging. So if I want to rotate around my model, I hold in Alt, left click, and while holding left click I simply drag left and right, up and down, and that way you can rotate all the way around any angle you like. Now while I'm rotating, I'm going to go back to System and show you another setting that I disabled from default for one very good reason. So if I go to Preferences and go to Display and then OpenGL, towards the bottom you have Viewport Rotation, and by default Trackball Rotation is turned on. So let me turn that on and show you what that looks like. Now all I'm going to do is press Alt, left click and drag as I did previously to rotate around my model, but watch this time. Now the camera sort of tumbles around, and try as I might, I just can't get used to this. It seems very clunky and unintuitive. Some people love this, I personally hate it. So the first thing I did is, as I say, System, Preferences, Display, OpenGL, Trackball Rotation. So now we're back to holding Alt, left click, drag, and that's back to normal. So that's the rotation sorted. Panning, if you wanted to pan left, right, up or down, you hold Alt, click and hold the middle mouse button and drag left, right, up and down, and that's just panning. Okay. In order to zoom, 2 different ways you can do it in Modo. You hold Alt, press and hold the right mouse button, drag right to zoom in and drag left to zoom out, in and out. And if you notice, wherever my cursor is when I start zooming, it'll zoom into that point. So hold my cursor down here, I'll zoom into there. Hold it over the front of the ship and zoom in there. The other way of zooming is by using the scroll wheel. You simply scroll up and scroll out. Up to scroll in, back to scroll out. And again, depending where your cursor is, that's where you're going to zoom. Now this is a little bit more jittery, not as smooth as zooming like this, but either way works. And that's navigation. And with that we come to the end of this first video, in which I touched upon the basics of the interface, touched on the 3D viewport properties, the different shading modes, and the navigation. Thank you for watching. Hopefully catch you next time. Please follow and subscribe for future videos.